Good evening. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics and to this evening's program, American Umpire, Film Screening and Q&A with Elizabeth Cobbs. Bill Lacey, director of the Dole Institute, will interview our guests this evening. Before I continue with the bio, I would like to recognize that we were honored, and we are honored to have guests today from the Harkins Institute. Would the four of you please stand so you can be recognized? They didn't know they were standing. But I will say to you, they're new. They're starting in a small building. If you remember how the Dole Institute, we started in a house, and they're getting started, and they just came to talk with us and find out some of the programs we did, and we're very pleased you do, and welcome. I would like to go on with our interview of our guest this evening, not the interview, but her bio. Elizabeth Cobbs holds the Melbourne Glasscock Chair in American History at Texas A&M University and is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. She is the author of 6 books, including American Umpire and The Hamilton Affair, a novel. You can see she's very diverse. Her next book sounds very exciting to me, and it's The Hello Girls, America's First Women Soldiers, forthcoming in April from Harvard University Press on the centennial of U.S. entry into World War I. She has written for the New York Times, Jerusalem Post, Los Angeles Times, and National Public Radio. Without further ado, would we please give a warm welcome to our guest this evening, Elizabeth Cobbs.
Elizabeth, let's start with, my question, which is, why did you decide to create both the book and the documentary about this subject?
Well, the book was just a part of my normal work as a historian, and the director of the film knew of the book and thought, well, maybe this would make a good movie. And I thought, my book, the movie, which sounded just like fun, although a little daunting. I'd never made a film before, so this was. It seemed like a good way to try to bring this conversation to America. If you write a history book, your students will read it and some other students will read it, but it doesn't give people a chance to really talk about these issues. And so it seemed a way to open the conversation up with everybody.
Okay. Why do you think people feel that there's a sense of crisis today, despite the world being, say, more stable and safer than it was 25, 30 years ago?
That is such a great question, Bill, because I often will say, you know what, you can go out and get a latte right after this talk. For the most part, we live our lives in very stable ways. We do not worry about being bombed as a country. We don't worry about our country being overrun, Western Europe falling. And so that sense of crisis, I was very taken with what one of the people we talked with said, Mr. Cohen, was that generating that sense of crisis sells newspapers. It causes some videos to go viral. It's a part, of course, the campaign cycle, and each party accusing the other of not doing enough, and so that constant ratcheting up. And I just don't think it's often responsible. So to me, I hate to be cynical about it, but in the newspaper business, they say if it bleeds, it leads. And so I'm always so grateful when I read a newspaper article, which is really about how the world is working, because for the most part, the world is working.
Okay. How did you assemble such an impressive group of individuals that would lend their words and their participation to your project?
Well, I think it's partly because all of these people really care about it. They really are interested, as you are, to take your time to come here tonight. And where do we go? And where do we want to be in 70 years? If this is what we've done for 70 years, and we don't have to argue about whether it was right or wrong, or when we got it right, or when we messed up, because people will disagree on those things. But we all do care about where to go forward. And I have to admit, my own little trick was I went and I asked George Shultz first. And I was saying earlier that here's a 95-year-old man who comes to work every day in a suit and tie. And when Secretary of State George Shultz said he would do it, nobody else dared say no.
Do you see an emerging principle guiding U.S. foreign policy that could replace the Truman Doctrine? Or are we not to that point yet?
You know, there's a debate about it, and so I don't want to say this is an answer that would come from me, all right? So that's why this is about what you think. This is about what we think as a people. However, now that I've thought about it a lot, I can tell you that I do think, actually, that it's time for a completely, a new doctrine that would incorporate wisdom of, of our founders with the wisdom and the things that we've learned and created over the past 70 years. I think it's time, and I think it's really incumbent upon us to be brave and courageous. Our policymakers have come up with marvelous things. Our country has created marvelous things over the last 240 years, and there's no reason to think that the greatest generation is not the next generation.
One of the themes that really stood out to me, and this is, I actually wanted to see this for the first time tonight, just so I could get kind of the impact that it has on you. The thing that really stands out to me is how the individuals that you interviewed really feel that the Europeans are taking advantage of us. What can we do to get the Europeans to step up and take a bigger role? What are some of the ideas being discussed?
I agree, and I found the same thing. I mean, to hear Condoleezza Rice say it's outrageous, I'm like, well, why don't we do something about it? And I think it's a real puzzle. I actually was in Finland this summer, and I said something to a taxi driver. I was telling him what I was doing and on my way to the airport, and what do you think? And he said, I think what's important is the question. If you really ask the question, the answer starts to become obvious. And I think we've been loath to ask the question because we're afraid that it'll look like isolationism, or it will look like we don't value our allies, that we don't appreciate the sacrifices that some of them have made, which we do. But there is a question of proportionality and relative responsibility. And it's okay to talk about that without feeling that we're being yellow-bellied isolationists or cowards or unhumanitarian. And so I think putting it right out there, personally, I think, I have children. Do you have children? And I know that if I offered to pay their bills for the rest of their life, well, first of all, I'm very grateful. I know they would say no. But I also think that it's incumbent upon me not to make those kind of offers. And people rise to the occasion. I was very touched by what General Mattis said, that there are people who will stand by us if we'll just let them. I wanted to ask him further what he meant by that, but I think he meant really what was right there on the surface.
Okay. I noticed, I just picked this up, and I'm curious if it meant anything or if it just happened to appear at the time. Right after he said that, they show the air crew and from Lithuania that's flying that plane. Was there a message there, or did that just happen?
Well, no, everything is there for a reason. I mean, the interesting thing about making a film is that it's so short, 56 minutes and 40 seconds, and anybody can turn it off in a nanosecond. So you have to keep, mixing it up. And what we wanted to show was that it really is possible. I mean, it's funny, Europe really did manage all on its own for centuries before the United States even came along. Now, part of what happened is that there was these hundreds of years of war, but they are pretty stable. And I mean, I think of it as being akin to, with the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine, the United States sort of helped Europeans and Asians up on their feet and sort of said, okay, you can make it, and we're going to be here. We're not going to let you fall. And then here's a walker, and hold on to the walker, and you're going to be strong again. But after the patient gets better, you don't keep saying, oh, keep using that walker. Oh, that walker, that's a really good thing. It creates dependency. One of the problems with dependency is that people don't feel confident in their own powers. You don't feel confident in their powers. And then ultimately, of course, people resent you for being dependent, and you resent them for their dependency. And it saps what we've built, I think. I really think it's quite a remarkable achievement of the 20th century that's due to the United States and due to our partners all around the world. And we need to acknowledge that, to solidify it, to let it stand, to let go of the walker.
Okay. Do you feel that what President Clinton said, that we're the indispensable nation, is that still true?
You know, I think it's just a problem when you use words like that. I mean, I liked how Madeleine Albright said it doesn't mean we're alone. I think there are many nations which are indispensable. I think the British are indispensable. When you sort of say, like, I'm the most important person here, it creates kind of a bad dynamic, I think. But certainly, America's involvement in the world is indispensable. And it's also indispensable that our allies are involved in the world. So that's that thing of you've got to be careful, I think, not to set up this pyramid over which we have to be king of the hill forever, because nobody's king of the hill forever. And it's dangerous. It's not healthy.
Okay, due to the length of the documentary tonight, we're going to really shorten the program, but I won't allow time for Q&A. So I have one last question, and then we will go to questions and answers from the audience. And you can ask Elizabeth anything you want to ask about her documentary. But we have quite a few Student Advisory Board members here tonight, and they're scattered throughout the crowd. We had a couple of them at dinner, and I'm just curious what you would say to our Student Advisory Board and other students here on campus about the importance of the U.S. playing this American umpire role into the future.
Well, I think that a role like umpire is a role. And one of the reasons why I wrote the book was to counter the idea that the U.S. is an empire, which is a commonly expressed sentiment, especially in my field in American history. And I think it's not only not true historically, it has a lot of pernicious outcomes to make that claim. It's like putting "kick me" on your back. But also, the thing is that empires, the presumption is they existed because they had to, for economic reasons, for control. And an umpire is a job that can be shared. So I think what I would say to this next generation is, how can we share this role? How can we make sure that we're playing together better as a team around the world, rather than pinning everything on one pillar? Because a system built on many pillars is stronger than a system built on one.
Okay, let's open it up to your questions and answers. Like I said, I tried to shorten things, so we have plenty of time for questions, and we'll start right over here.
Hi, so I was wondering, I'm interested in the notion that one of the first questions that we should ask when considering foreign affairs is what's in it for us. So for example, if we know that there are atrocities being committed in another country and we are able to do something about it, should we wait just because it's not beneficial directly to us and no one else is stepping up? Or what other factors should we take into consideration when we are getting involved in foreign affairs?
Yeah, that's a potent phrase that and I myself, I rankle at it sometimes. I think, what is the role of self-interest in things? Sometimes self-interest is, if you're a sailor, there's something called a storm anchor. It's when you trail a sail behind you in the water. It keeps your bow pointed towards, you don't tip over. And self-interest can be helpful, and humanitarian problems, impulses can spiral out of control. It's helpful to balance it in a way with how is this going to work out for us. What you just said, when there are things happening in other countries that we can do something about, the part that I think we often don't look at very carefully is what we can do and accomplish. And that sometimes we get involved in things that we can't actually accomplish. We cannot keep people from having political instability. I mean, we learned this in a way in the war in Vietnam. And after that period of time, a lot of people said, oh, civil wars, right. You can't solve a civil war. They have to decide that they want to cooperate with each other, or they have to keep killing each other until they're tired of it, as we did in the American Civil War. So it's this question, what can you do, I think, is something we don't look carefully at enough because of our humanitarian concerns. So maybe that kind of more practical way of looking at things would help us, like a storm anchor helps keep a ship pointed in the right direction.
Okay, we have a question right here.
I'm curious, generally speaking, what would be the percent of military spending on the GNP compared with now and when Dwight Eisenhower made his famous industrial military complex statement? And since we're in Kansas, what's your speculation on how Eisenhower would see the world and U.S. relationship in it today, for better and for worse?
I got to tell you, I don't have those percentages off the top of my head, 1959, when he made that speech, and today. you know, in some ways, I mean, U.S. military spending has gone up and gone down, and some military people would say it's actually much less, you know, and certainly is less than it was 5 or 6 years ago. One way to think of it is that a fifth of our federal government budget, a fifth of our federal, you know, expenditure is in some way on national defense. And that's a very large percentage of the budget. It's about 4%, it varies again year to year, of our gross domestic product. Of course, in NATO, there are 28 members of NATO. Of the 28, there are only 5 that actually make even 2%. That includes us. We make twice that. And there are quite a few which don't even do 1%. And it's an agreement amongst NATO members that all NATO members will spend 2% of their GDP on defense, because if they're not capable of defending themselves, then we feel that we have to do it. And it's a problem when you keep defending other people who are saying, well, I just don't have to spend that kind of money. So what would President Eisenhower think about it? I think he would be very concerned. I mean, it was he who said, there is a problem for liberty when we spend so much in defense. And he was echoing the long tradition of American history, which was the idea that a large standing army eats away at the foundation of a society. I mean, that was just the belief of our founding fathers. And for 150 years, you know, they managed the country fairly well, pursuing that course. So I think that certainly Truman would be very surprised, our Missouri neighbors would be very surprised at this. You know, the U.S. was bringing men home from World War II. They had what they call bring back daddy clubs. Women kept sending them little baby booties. Okay, time to come home. But it was largely the Soviet coup d'etat inspired coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia that finally convinced Truman that something that the Europeans were saying, which is that no, you've got to stay. So the idea of staying after the war is what's so different. America has had wars, but the idea of staying to defend other people rather than ourselves, what's in it for us, is something that's very new in American history.
Okay. Adam, do you have a question?
Thanks for the thought-provoking film. What would you say to those who argue that the United States needs to maintain a large global footprint to keep the dollar as the global reserve currency?
Well, I think that's a very dangerous notion. Now that starts to go towards the E word that I usually try to avoid. And the United States was the world's largest economy in 1890. So this was, 20-something years before we intervened in World War I, which took us a long time to get involved in too. So the notion that the only way that we can really, shore up the world, or that the world can have a reserve currency, is to have this global footprint, seems to me probably not true, although I'm not an economist, and also certainly dangerous. That's a bad reason to have men and women in arms around the world to defend the dollar. That's not what America is about.
Okay, we have another question here.
We didn't stay in Iraq, and now the United States is being roundly criticized for creating a vacuum, which many say is the cause of much of the terrorism that we're seeing today. How does the potential of new vacuums around the world, how does that play into America rethinking its position in the world security?
Right. And that's such an important question, and I know it's a question on everyone's minds. And of course, there are never, ever any guarantees to the future. One thing we do know is that the interventions in the Middle East have not produced a more stable Middle East, and that goes back quite a ways. Certainly that doesn't begin with the second war in Iraq by any means. There are many people who feel that each intervention in a way ratchets up the instability of the Middle East, which is an area that has a lot of problems. So does Venezuela, by the way. There are power vacuums all around the world. I mean, I think one of the one of the issues of this era in which empires have been replaced by nation states, and now there are 200, whereas there were 50. I mean, the number grows, is that you do have a lot of areas where people are still duking it out, as we did in the Americas, by the way, through the 19th century when the Spanish and British empires and French empires disappeared. Took a long time for our countries on this side of the hemisphere to become as stable as they are today. I guess the question is, I think if we believe we own the world's problems, then we will own the world's problems. And I think that's a lot for any one country. So in terms of terrorism, I was sitting next to a good friend who came with me tonight, and she was saying, well, they don't feel so secure now, those European countries, because of terrorism in France and all that. But keep in mind the kind of problems that those are. And that's the important thing, is to parse out what kind of problems we're talking about. We're not talking about a worldwide movement to take over the globe by the Soviet Union or by Hitler. What we're talking about are major policing problems. Now, the British had problems in Northern Ireland and in their own country for a long time because of Irish terrorism spilling over into their country. And they did not build any new aircraft carriers to solve that problem. It was a question of trying to contain it as much as possible until there could be a domestic, peaceful solution amongst the Irish. And it took a long time. It took most of the century, from 1922 until 1998. But it wasn't to be solved by landing massive amounts of troops. So I think that that's a problem. This is not to say that those are not issues, but the question is, what's the kind of problem? What's the size of the problem? What's the best solution for the problem? And it might not be maintaining large bases, because that just kind of upsets a lot of folks in those areas, and some of whom then become terrorists.
Okay, we have a question right here.
Gosh, too many questions. I got to settle on one. If I were France or United Kingdom or Germany today, I would say, okay, United States, we're absorbing all of these immigrants, and we're going to incur the expenses of integrating them into our countries, and we're probably going to get a lot more. So, given those expenses, it's going to be up to you, United States, to keep your aircraft carriers at sea and to keep things under control, because we here in Europe have a lot of problems of our own with these new waves of immigrants. And one other point on that is that I think the United States will maintain a significant base in Germany, because no one wants Germany to become a monster again. And we're simply going to have to be there.
And I'm sure there's some people, especially older and in the World War II generation, who have that fear. And the Russians have had that fear all along. They never trust Germans. And I was actually talking with a journalist from Tokyo, Asahi Shimbun, I think is the name of the major newspaper, and he was saying, well, what about, I was saying, maybe Japan should defend Japan. And he said, oh, well, we're not sure we can trust ourselves to do that. And I said, well, we trust you. Why can't you trust yourselves? Don't just be imperialists. Like, don't try and conquer China again. But also one thing to keep in mind is that because the structure of the world has moved on, we are not in 1947. That today, for example, China depends heavily on South Korea for semiconductors. And they depend heavily on Japan for semiconductors. The last thing that China wants to see is South Korea evaporate, right? So, but we're there with our finger in the dike for 63 years. There's not even a peace treaty. The North keeps sharpening its weapons, and so the stability that we provide is not necessarily as stable as it sometimes seems, especially when there are regional actors whose own self-interest could be perhaps harnessed for them to take a bigger role in what really is a regional problem. North Korea is not going to take over the world ever, all right? And the chances, I don't honestly personally think that the chances are that Germany now wants to take over the world. As Jaffe says, they found out that it was safer and more profitable to polish their BMWs than their jackboots. So our understanding, I try to, and I have sometimes a hard time making the argument, but I think that we recognize and we can see how big changes have happened in the world when we look at things like industrialization. Nobody wants to go back to hunting and gathering, really. Or the Neolithic Revolution, right? Nobody wants to go back to not having farming and things like that. So farming or machines, or there are major changes that happen in the world, technological changes. And we sometimes forget that the same thing does happen in human relations as well. That sometimes people realize that there's a better way of doing something and tend to gravitate towards it. So the diminishment of war, that has happened all around the world. In fact, the diminishment of violence of all types, that has happened since the 1940s. Certainly it comes from a number of factors, but part of it is simply that it didn't work. And people seem to have found better ways of handling problems.
Okay, we have a question right here.
Okay. If we had been wiser sooner and not going into Iraq to start with, we wouldn't have had to get out.
You know, some people say to me, well, why don't we just stop? Just say no. And I think it takes a while for people to figure things out. You know, it's easy to be critical and look back and say, well, why didn't President so-and-so do such and such? Clearly, they should have. You know, and it's hard to know those things at the time. If Senator Dole were here, I think he probably would say, you don't see it all coming. There's also this notion of what psychologists will call path dependence. When you're on a path for a long, long time, you kind of don't see that there are others, and or inertia. And one of the reasons why we made the film is to say there are paths. We followed one path for 150 years. It was a good path. It had some problems, but it was a solid path. We followed now another path for 70 years, and there have been some great successes and some terrible failures. But it was a path that made sense. And maybe there is a third path, that we can think outside this and not feel. And I think our President Obama said a year and a half ago in this famous article in the Atlantic Monthly that every time he tries to make a different decision, somebody shows up with the Washington playbook and said, but sir, it's not here in the playbook. And this is the playbook of the last 70 years. And so if something truly terrible happens in, say, Syria, we say, oh my gosh, I guess we gotta go, There's a problem, dial 911 USA, they're the ones, call them. They might show up and blow it, but who else are we gonna call? Rather than saying, okay guys, it's time, And we really mean it. And we mean it to ourselves too, because we do volunteer. And we need to learn how not to.
Okay, we got a question back here.
So you just kind of touched on the Syria thing, but so then would you say that the current situation in Syria with letting Russia come in and have a bigger role there is something we should be comfortable with? And because there's just a lot of talk of fears about that, and so I was curious if you think that's an appropriate situation where another larger power we should just leave it to them and not worry so much about it, I guess my question.
You always feel terrible saying something like, let the Russians do it, because we have this suspicion, et cetera. But when Russia was intervening in North Vietnam and then China was intervening in North Vietnam, we thought, well, that means we for sure have to be there because they're there. And you don't really have to, I don't think. Let's play it out. Let's say Russia brings the civil war there to an end and the Assad regime is ensconced. Let's just think this through. And Russia becomes the best friend of Assad. Okay, now let's think of all that's going to buy Putin. That's going to buy Putin Assad's friendship. Think about how important that's going to be on the world stage. Think about how many friends the United States still has. Think about how many friends Putin has or China has. So we've been much better at developing allies. We have a lot of them. We don't have to win every game. We don't have to have everybody like us. But to be the best country we can be, a lot of why the world democratized over a period and republics formed and empires fell over a period of 250 years. And usually it wasn't because there was a Marine standing there making them do it. It's partly because the United States had a very effective system of government. The European Union formed as a kind of quasi-imitation of the United States because they said, gosh, that's so much better. Take down those borders between Vermont and, not between Vermont, but take them down between Belgium and Luxembourg. And you know what, we'll grow our economy. And look at Europe today. So that being a role model is an important part of our leadership. It's a part of our leadership and probably the most successful aspect of our leadership over the course of our national history.
Okay, we're going to take, I think, one more question. Oh, actually, well, we'll get you too, sir, but.
All right. I was just wondering about the East Asian case. We've talked about it a little bit already. Some analysts think that China is poised to assert its hegemony over the whole region, North China Sea, South China Sea, and all the nations that border it. Those nations, some of them have a history of great adversity and antagonism, and I think are extremely grateful that the U.S. is there so they don't have to relate to each other, which is the one horror they cannot imagine, and that the U.S. easily solves for them. It allows them to live gracefully in the world, which would otherwise be difficult. But the question is, do you think it's wise for the U.S. to pull out of the Western Pacific region altogether, given this possibility of Chinese hegemony, and also the history of adversity between the nations that are located there?
Well, I guess it was Pierre Trudeau who said, you know, living next to the United States is like sleeping next to an elephant, you know, and every twitch, you know, you feel every twitch. One of the problems, anytime we make any move, announce anything, it's like, oh my God, all the tea leaves come out. What does this all mean? If the U.S. puts 500 more soldiers in Australia or puts 500 more in the Philippines. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's not all happiness and light. Some of these countries especially have especially great worries in relation to Japan. China has not had, of all the major nation states, it has the least history of outward expansive aggressiveness. If you compare it with Spain or the Netherlands or even the United States. So I don't know what would happen, but I do know that whenever we ratchet up, other countries, especially like China, feel the need to do the same. So there's always this dilemma. The more you increase your national security, the more other countries do feel the need to compensate as well. So in terms of China, yes, I think that China wants to be a major player in that region. Again, let's think through what that could mean. Does that mean that China wants to take over the Philippines, invade the Philippines, and start ruling the Philippines? Okay, let's say they try that for a minute. China, as you know, is a really large country that has a lot of challenges just ruling its own territory, right? That is a perennial conversation in Chinese history. And so the chances that that's going to help them with their most important project, which is corralling 1 billion people and feeding them all, is not very likely. So if you think of self-interest, what somebody's going to get out of something, it helps you think through how difficult it's going to be. So should the United States be there because Japan can't trust itself? Should the United States be there because otherwise North Korea is going to invade South Korea? Now, of course, if they do, South Korea might try to defend itself. There might even create nuclear weapons. I mean, this is the other thing that people always worry about. If we hold all the nuclear weapons, maybe nobody else will have them. That hasn't entirely proven to be the case in any case, as we know in Israel. But it seems to me that those are questions that we really have to start thinking through with our allies, because it doesn't seem to be fair or entirely stable, the arrangement we have currently. And I think that we tend to overestimate these threats sometimes.
Okay, we're going to do our final question right here.
Okay, I'll put you on the spot. If you're president and somehow you could get Congress, we could do worse. Somehow we could get Congress to go along with some of the ideas of cutting the military spending. inviting our allies to share the burden. I think you're probably going to get some of the fear-mongering, which you talked about, particularly domestically. Oh my God, we're going to be closing military, naval bases, going to have a lot of northern contractors in northern Virginia really, really upset, and I think the military-industrial complex still leaves. So Liz, what creative vision could you give people to reassure them?
All right. Well, since no one's asked me yet, other than you, sir, so I hope I have your vote.
Are you declaring your candidacy
It's
tonight?
the only vote I got. You know, I think I was saying how delighted I am to be here in Kansas, and I have to admit it's my first time in Kansas, so thank you so much for welcoming me here. And you know, I like to think that, you know, someone was saying, oh, we need to harness the right and the left. I'm like, no, let's put the American people, at the center of this. I mean, think of the money that we do spend on military things, and there are contractors who benefit from it economically. But if we spent those dollars on other kinds of things, other people would benefit economically, and they would have a self-interest in keeping us building maybe better schools and roads. I don't know what we would choose to spend the money on. Maybe some of it would go back to the taxpayer. So I think that what I would articulate, or we would articulate together, Bill and I, what we call the Lacey-Cobbs doctrine, possibly, would be a doctrine of interdependence with the rest of the world, but true interdependence, and no going farther than other people go. Understanding that they are strong, that they are prosperous, that they share our values, meaning that these are global values. These are not American values. The idea that all men are created equal comes from like England and France, you know, or the idea of capitalism as the most useful economic system that comes from Scotland and, you know, Adam Smith. And so these are values that really have traveled all around the world, that they don't belong to anybody any more than, you know, Christianity belongs to the Middle East, which is where it started, or corn belongs to Mexico because they hybridized it, or wheat to Iraq. These are global values in the same way that industrialization has globalized. And so I think that I would say, Bill, that we should demand that America move towards a policy of interdependence and doing our share, our fair share, and that will cause other people to rise to the occasion. Why not?
Okay.
It's better than what we've done.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for tonight. Appreciate it. Wonderful, wonderful documentary, very exciting, and thank you all for coming out tonight. Would tell you that a week from Wednesday night, we will be featuring Andrew Marinus, who has an award-winning book called Strong Inside, which is the story of Perry Wallace, who was the first African-American scholarship athlete in the Southeastern Conference and the challenges that he faced. So I would encourage everybody to think about coming to that, and also catching Steve Kraski's discussion groups on the election on Tuesday afternoon. Thank you all for coming out tonight.